Another possible threat rising in the South China Sea.
China does not want you to see. The United States says the superpower is reclaiming land.
Those territorial claims can be so scattered they almost appear like a game of Chinese checkers.
Chinese construction crews have been dumping massive amounts of white sand in 7 spots in the South China Sea.
And that's an issue for 5 neighboring countries and territories, including Vietnam and the Philippines.
Vietnam is ramping up its island building activity in Spratly Islands, part of which is being claimed by the Philippines.
Vietnam is getting ready to completely obliterate China. In a move that's bound to escalate tension, Vietnam has increased its island building in the hotly disputed South China Sea. Reports show that in the past 3 years, Vietnam has reclaimed 2,000 acres of land from the ocean, and since November 2023, it's already claimed 700 acres. With this land, Vietnam is working to slowly destroy China by building artificial islands and militarily expanding to be able to fight Beijing in a potential war. The most genius part of the plan is the fact that Vietnam has taken this idea straight from China, which has been building artificial islands in the South China Sea for years now, giving China a taste of its own medicine. So, what's Vietnam's secret plan for China's destruction? Who are the players in the fight for the South China Sea? How will all this play out? In this video, we'll answer these questions and more. We are constantly fighting CCP bots that downvote our content and leave negative comments on our videos. We'd appreciate it if you could support us by liking our videos and sharing them with your friends and family too. Right, let's get into today's video. The reality is that China's a bully, and it was only a matter of time before a Southeast Asian country stepped in to do something about it. Take this story for instance. In late September, 10 Vietnamese soldiers were attacked by China, and 4 tons of their catch was seized. Tian Phong, one of the fishermen, claims that 2 boats approached them from the rear and the front. The people in these boats got out and started beating up the fishermen with a 3-foot-long pole. 3 of them suffered grave injuries and had to be rushed to the hospital. This news caused a massive uproar in Vietnam, since the fishermen were in Vietnamese waters. This is not the first time that China's acted this way, and what we're seeing happen with Vietnam is in response to this type of aggression. Since 2015, Vietnam has been slowly building a base on its claimed islands in preparation for an attack against China. The Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative reported that Vietnam has already expanded dredging and landfill work at several of its outposts in the Spratly Islands. This has created about 420 acres, or 170 hectares in 2022. And comes to a grand total of 540 acres or 219 hectares in the last 10 years. The Spratly Islands that Vietnam has claimed are called Nam Yet Island, Pearson Reef, Sand Cay, and Tennant Reef. So far, these are the islands where the most amount of work is being done. To develop the area, Vietnam is using clamshell dredgers and other high-end construction equipment to scoop up parts of the shallow reef and deposit them in the areas where they want to create land. This development is going to make it possible for bigger vessels to land on the island, especially military ones. At 5 of the islets, which are basically small islands, new landfill work has already begun, with the purpose of creating small rigs and platforms on the islands. There are already 51 outposts spread across the islands, and at the rate of development, there's bound to be a lot more. Vietnam has also begun to add buildings to the major islets, and research by the US think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, shows that the work has included new communications equipment, a sports field, and the extension of a runway to about 1.31 miles or 1,300 meters on its largest holding on the Spratly Islands. The Bark Canada Reef, which is Vietnam's biggest outpost, has doubled in size over the past 6 months, from 238 to 412 acres. The reef now measures 2.68 miles or 4,318 meters, meaning it could potentially be used to build a 1.86 mile or 3,000 meter runway. China has runways of its own like this on Fiery Cross, Mischief, and Subi reefs. Vietnam's development of buildings and infrastructure on the islands has been uneventful, but the interesting developments that everybody's really concerned about are the military ones. The Chinese think tank, the South China Sea Probing Initiative, believes that Vietnam is trying to pretend like the work it's doing on the island is for civilian use, while it's actually building up the islets for military purposes. Vietnam has created 102 new acres of land at Discovery Great Reef, 52 acres at South Reef, 41 acres at Nam Yet Island, and 37 acres at Pearson Reef. All of this expansion has been for the purpose of turning these islets into military and logistical bases for the South China Sea. There's also been an increase of Vietnamese troops and civilians on these islands and reefs as Vietnam works swiftly to transform the territory into a military hub. The Strategic Probing Initiative carried out a detailed investigation of military activities on the Vietnamese claimed islands and came out with some shocking results. Naval Regions 2 and 4 of the Vietnamese Navy cover the Spratly Islands with 2 units stationed at Quan Do Trong Sa. Naval Region 4 has been on the islands ever since they were seized from China in 1978. These 2 units regularly carry out garrison and anti-landing operations on the islands and reefs, and have suspiciously stopped foreign ships from approaching them to gain control of the waters. What's even more alarming for China is the fact that over 2,000 soldiers have been deployed to defend the islands and reefs. The developments on the island are also extensive, with fortifications created by combining fields and permanent fortifications. The military has also set up the ground battlefields, underground bunkers, and combat and living facilities. The islands with the most military presence are Spratly Island and Nam Yet Island, where battalion-ready units of troops are stationed. The artillery that's also been found on the island shows that Vietnam is not just looking to bolster an area of defense. The island has 4.8-inch howitzers and 5.8-inch cannons, T-34-85 medium tanks, PT-76 amphibious light tanks, and Type 63 amphibious light tanks. Vietnam has also created an air defense firepower with 0.9-inch and 1.5-inch anti-aircraft guns. While most of the artillery is old and from the Soviet era, it's still pretty useful. On top of all this, Vietnam also has a VRS-CSX X-band medium-range coastal warning radar system that can detect targets as far as 105 miles or 170 kilometers. All of this is just for 2 reefs, but there's more military presence, even on the smaller ones. On 11 other reefs, Vietnam has defensive facilities that are meant to form loose defenses. Each of these reef forts has a squad of soldiers stationed there with anti-aircraft machine guns, RPG-7 and Kalashnikov assault rifles, and several machine gun bunkers. This level of military expansion and fortification is not simple defense preparation. Vietnam has had a long time to watch China's aggression in the South China Sea, and it's clear that Hanoi is preparing to go head-to-head with Beijing. What's more interesting about Vietnam's strategy is that it's been taken straight out of China's handbook. Since 2013, China's built on a total of 7 Spratly Islands. China's been working tirelessly to try and fortify its claim of the islands, and images taken by a Filipino photographer, Ezra Akayan, show island bases that are considered to be unsinkable aircraft carriers. These bases are being used by the PLA to hunt submarines in the South China Sea. To fortify the artificial islands, China's also added more buildings, radars, and aircraft hangars. In the images taken by the Filipino photographer, you can clearly see military camps and large aircraft hangars on all 7 Chinese artificial islands. We need to go back a bit because these artificial islands haven't always existed. In order to be able to build its structures, China needed to establish more land on the sea. And since islands are made of sand, the task was pretty simple. To be able to construct these artificial islands, China began by building on top of already existing islands, rocks, and even coral reefs. On top of these existing structures, China basically poured a whole lot of sand using dredgers, which are basically ships that pick up material and move it from the sea floor. The mechanism of these dredgers is pretty advanced. The ships use large tubes with cutting attachments at the end to grind up material on the sea floor and suck it up. This material is then carried through the pipes or hoses and dumped on top of existing formations. Once the islands are big enough, China can then lay down cement and build structures on them. A lot of sand is used in the process, because in order to build important structures like military bases and airstrips, you need a whole lot of land. According to research by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, China's man-made contraptions currently have almost 32,000 acres of new land. Unlike Vietnam, where parts of its islands are for civilian use, the entire 7 islands are being used for China's military capability. Photographs like the ones we showed you earlier revealed that the islands are so covered by military bases that they don't have space to plant a single tree. The military bases on the islands have missile systems, radars, runways specifically made to carry heavy aircraft, fuel storage, and naval facilities. With such an extensive military presence on their islands, it's no surprise that Vietnam's working hard to bolster its military presence too. According to Dr. Malcolm Davis, a defense strategy and capability senior analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the resources concentrated on these Chinese islands give China enough power to overwhelm the Association of Southeast Asian Nations military. This is crazy considering the fact that this association includes Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. ASEAN's a regional organization that's working to promote economic growth and cultural development in Southeast Asia. This organization's had to deal with China's aggression in the South China Sea for a hot minute, and the fact that China's artificial islands have the power to project military power from northern Australia or into the Indian Ocean is the reason countries like Vietnam are soldiering up. China's aim in its military expansion is to fortify its claims that most of the territories in the South China Sea belong to it. Vietnam's aim is to solidify its territories and fight back against China's aggressive expansion in the region. Recently, we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time. Or they ask the same question we've answered before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get your email bootcamp by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Now, back to the video. As Vietnam's continued on with its expansion, it seems that China's the only one bothered by its actions. Most of the countries in Southeast Asia understand Vietnam's objectives and stand by them. To them, China's actions are destabilizing because it's using its islands to harass Southeast Asian countries. According to Alan Chong, associate professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, they've never had, I think, a standoff with any other country, because all the other claimants have respectfully kept their developable spheres around the South China Sea. And I think there's this intra-ASEAN consensus that within ASEAN, the claimants do not rock the boat so as to present a common front towards China. Vietnam's been respectful of the territories that the Philippines and Taiwan have claimed, so they have no reason to worry. The way Beijing sees it, Hanoi's reinforcing illegally held features by land reclamation and military development, as well as setting up defenses and operating on these islands and reefs. Not surprisingly, China's reaction is very hypocritical. It acknowledges that the construction by Vietnam is not at the same scale or speed as China's, but still goes on to villainize their actions. Beijing actually believes that because Vietnam's been secretive and meticulous in its activities, the international community has more to worry about. These responses to Vietnam's expansion are from think pieces and articles, but the Chinese government has not responded officially to what's happening. When you think about it, China's silence could be very strategic. Bill Hayton, an associate fellow at the Asia-Pacific program of Chatham House, stated that, as far as we know, China has not tried to interfere with Vietnam's construction on these reefs. This is interesting considering what its reaction has been to the Philippines' attempts to reinforce the BRP Sierra Madre. The BRP Sierra Madre is a Philippine Navy ship that has historical and sentimental value from its time in World War II. It's become an observation point at the Second Thomas Shoal, but China has constantly attempted to blockade it. China's response to a Navy ship docked on an island and its response to Vietnam's military expansion is clearly disproportionate. On a diplomatic level, it can't outrightly condemn Vietnam's activities, so it's rather choosing to bide its time and wait for an opportunity to strike. It may also be that Beijing's not ready to escalate tensions in the South China Sea, and so it's chosen not to comment on Hanoi's land reclamation operations right now. Hanoi's making headlines now for its activities in the South China Sea, but its work in the area dates all the way back to 1975, when Vietnam occupied 5 islands and emancipated them under the name Quan Dao Trong Sa. Vietnam chose these specific islands because of their positioning and the potential they had for oil exploration and maritime trade. In 1998, the country also took over 24 islands and reefs, bringing its total to 29 islands. The first step for Vietnam was its land reclamation and construction project. It started in 2007, and at the time, Vietnam didn't have a lot to work with. It used excavators to build seawalls and cofferdams with coral sand in the shallow water, and then used excavators to dredge sand from coral reefs on seawalls from both sides. Next, Vietnam created breakwaters, which are basically used to protect an island from tides and currents. The stones used to build breakwaters at harbors were transported from Vietnam by sea. In its first stage, Vietnam expanded the area on the islands from about 140,000 square yards to 270,000 square yards. From this, they developed a harbor that could accommodate 1,000 tonnage vessels. After building this base, things accelerated in 2015, and all the construction we spoke about earlier took place. China's frustration probably stems from the fact that it didn't expect this level of development from Vietnam so quickly. As the friction between the two nations escalates, China is realizing that Vietnam could be a worthy contender in the South China Sea. While the focus is on fortifying claims in the region, there are some environmental concerns at play that nobody's recognizing. So let's talk about it. Coral reefs are beautiful ecosystems where thousands of sea creatures live. When you pile sand on top of them, you're basically killing these creatures. There's a loss of thousands of different species happening in the South China Sea because of the construction of these artificial islands. Professor John McManus explains the situation best, stating, "The sand and silt stirred up by the dredgers covers most of the lagoon, and it's settling out on most of the remaining reef. The sand will kill nearly any bottom-dwelling organisms on which it settles in large quantities and clogs the gills of most fish. The saddest part about all of this is that the damage done is irreversible. Corals that are buried under sand cannot recover, and this means that thousands of species in the sea could be destroyed. The destruction of corals has a domino effect on sea life, so let's walk through it. Construction causes a loss of natural sunlight to the coral reefs, which means the reefs won't grow. This leads to the rapid growth of harmful algae blooms. These harmful algae blooms reduce the oxygen available and induce acidification, which then leads to coral erosion. Coral erosion's a problem because migratory fish feed on the larvae in the corals, and if they have no food, there's no need to be there. The artificial building of islands in the areas led to a deep decline in fishing stock in the region. According to the Maritime Executive, fish stocks have declined by 1/3 and are expected to decrease by an additional 59% by 2045 if current practices persist. This means that livelihoods are at stake if this continues. For most countries in the Indo-Pacific region, fishing is a source of employment and sustenance. On a national level, countries' food security and GDP contributions could be affected by this construction. With all that being said, environmentalists report that the way that Vietnam has been building its islands has been less environmentally taxing than China. According to the AMTI, Vietnam's method is considerably less damaging to the wider environment. Though, of course, destroying 520 acres of coral reef is still quite bad for the environment and fisheries. The environmental aspect is not as important for China and Vietnam because its focus is political. The battle for the South China Seas has more players than just Vietnam and China. For China, all of its territorial claims are fueled by the idea of the 9-dash line. Based on this, China claims the Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, Scarborough, and other reefs on the sea. China's legal claim is basically that it called dibs first. It asserts that the South China Sea was discovered in the 3rd century and mapped out by Chinese scholars. This is backed up by the fact that there is evidence from some of the islands of Han Dynasty-era artifacts. Because of this evidence, China feels that any other claims that have been made are illegitimate. Every time any other territory tried to assert a claim in the sea, China would push back. In the 1900s, China and Vietnam fought for the Spratly and Paracel Islands. China won this particular fight in 1974, when it seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam and killed more than 65 Vietnamese soldiers in the process. The fight for the Paracel Islands began in 1973, when China began to assert its claims of the island. During the battle, Chinese frigates engaged the South Vietnamese ships and sank them. Although Vietnam kept parts of the Spratlys, it completely lost the Paracels here. Things got a lot more serious in 2012 when China began to snatch away more islands, which started a quarrel between China and the Philippines over the Scarborough Shoal. Not being able to come to a resolution, the Philippines filed an arbitration case with the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The basis of the claim was the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which China is a signatory to. At this stage, the Philippines had tried everything, and this was a last-ditch attempt at saving the situation. The Philippines wanted the court to rule on what territorial claims it owned in the South China Sea, and to determine if China had infringed on its territorial rights through China's construction and fishing activities. The problem was that China refused to take part in the case, claiming that the UNCLOS was beyond the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. On July 12, 2016, the Arbitral Tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines, determining that major elements of China's claim, including its 9-line dash, recent land reclamation activities, and other activities in Philippine waters, were unlawful. The ruling did very little for the Philippines, and China continued on as if nothing had changed. The disputes between China and the Philippines have gotten so intense that both of their coast guards have reportedly been attacked. In August, there was a reported case of Chinese and Philippine vessels colliding near the Sabina Shoal. The Chinese coast guards claimed that it was the Philippines vessel's fault and that it had deliberately hit them. Then again, in that same week, a second round of collisions took place and both sides claimed innocence. China's claim was that the Philippine ship was illegally stranded at the shoal and deliberately rammed into them. The attacks between the two countries are not even limited to just their coast guards. In January, a Filipino fishing boat captain claimed the Chinese Coast Guard drove him away from Scarborough Shoal and bullied him into dumping everything he'd caught into the sea. The Philippines has consistently fought back against China's bullying tactics, and in one incident, about 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen broke through the blockade of Chinese vessels and reached the shoal. At first, it was friendly fire and a few jabs here and there. But there have been occasions when Chinese Coast Guard ships fired water cannons at Philippine patrol vessels. In one dangerous instance, a Filipino soldier lost one of his fingers. Then we have China's confrontations with Taiwan as well. China's anger with Taiwan in this case is the fact that it allows the US to use its claimed islands for military purposes. Taiwan and the US have worked closely in the South China Sea to push back against Chinese aggression. In response to this, China has attacked Taiwan's claimed islands, accusing the US of militarizing the South China Sea through its air and naval patrols. Vietnam has been watching all of this unfold and has realized that China's a bully that needs to be stopped. Its confrontations and incidents with the Philippines and Taiwan seem like small disagreements, but Vietnam understands that it's important not to underestimate China. This fight's also about the influence in the region for Vietnam. Its militarization in the region is also aimed at fortifying its claim in the South China Sea, too. According to Na Pham, a Vietnamese journalist, the official narrative is always that Vietnam is doing some small-scale construction to strengthen weather shelters for fishermen and to prevent erosion. But it's all being done by the military, and it's fair to say that Hanoi's been militarizing its maritime features, but at a much slower pace and at a scale far smaller than that of China. The South China Sea is one of the busiest trading routes in the world, and Vietnam also wants a slice of the pie. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, more than $5.3 trillion worth of shipping travels through the sea each year, and $1.2 trillion of this trade belongs to the United States. This is why nations like Vietnam and the Philippines are fighting so hard against China's territorial claims. If China's left to expand, it will be in control of this shipping route. The South China Sea is also full of hidden resources, and the potential in the region is endless. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, there are about 11 billion barrels of oil in the South China Sea, as well as 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. As we discussed previously, the region's very important for fishing, too. China's as aggressive as it is in the region because a large part of its economy is centered on fishing. Currently, China accounts for 17.4% of the world's marine. The runner-up is Indonesia, and China makes 3 times more than it does. All this makes the battle for the region pretty intense and fuels Vietnam and China's rapid military expansion in the Spratly Islands. The increase in military expansion by Vietnam in the Spratly Islands is a definite cause of concern for China. Before 2015, land reclamation was happening gradually, but after that, Hanoi's expansion has been rapid. The most concerning of its actions is the movement of artillery to the islands, which is a clear sign that preparations are underway for something. While China may have chosen to let this slide for now, it must be noted that this rapid expansion by Hanoi is telling of potential plans for invasion.